All right, so in this video, you're going to learn about the fundamental concept of variables. Variables are a fundamental concept of every programming language in the world so far, I guess. But what actually is a variable? Well, we can say that a variable is like a container in which we can store a value in order to use it over and over again in our code instead of having to write the value each time that we want to use it. So let's leave this console here. And now down here, let me show you how to declare a variable, all right, for the very first time. So we have to declare the variable, and we will use the var keyword and then the name of the variable. Got it? So I'm going to call this one name, then equal, and then the value that you want to assign to the variable. So in this case, what I want to assign is a text string called Alex. And then again, our semicolon at the end. And so with this, we just declared our very first variable. How'd that feel? So the variable name here is name, and the value that we assign to that variable is Alex. So you can basically think of this variable, this name variable here, as a piece of memory in your computer in which this Alex string is stored. So I use these quotes here to declare this text here. So this string. I could also have used double quotes like this, but I think it's a bit more modern to simply use these single quotes. Now, when we declare some text, we usually just use the single quotes like this here. So throughout the section, we will be using variables about persons for all the different examples. So stuff like names or jobs or age or something like that. All right, so now let's do another console.log. And what we're going to log now is simply the name variable. And so what do you think is going to happen when we reload our page? Well, let's have a look. And that's right. You now see Alex logged to our console, and that's because we assigned Alex to this variable. And then JavaScript can just retrieve the value of this variable here, which we have declared to be Alex. All right, does that make sense? So effectively, the name that we have here is the same as Alex. Cool. So let's declare another one. And again, we have to use var. And now let's say school team equals. Then again, I'll use quotes. And then let's just say it's basketball. So school team, and that's basketball. And let's declare another one called school number. And let's say that Alex's school number is 20. Okay, so you see that now it's no longer a string like we had here, but now it's a number. So that means that it's a different type of data. So here we have text, but here we have numbers. So that means now is a good time to talk about different data types in JavaScript. So in JavaScript, there are 5 different types of data: number, string, Boolean, undefined, and null. So far, we've already seen the number in the string. Now, primitive data types just means that it's not for objects, unlike most things in JavaScript, right? Because it's an object-oriented language. So they're just simple, primitive, non-object data types. And first off, we have strings, which are simply a sequence of characters. And so they're just used for text, like with that example before, with the name of the school team. All right, so next we have numbers. So JavaScript numbers are always something called floating point numbers. And that simply means that they always have decimals, even if we sometimes don't see them or don't define them. For example, 20, well, it's just like having 20.0. All right? Now, in other programming languages, it doesn't necessarily work like this, and you might have some other different data types for integers and decimals, but Not here in JavaScript. Okay. So here, all numbers are simply float numbers, even if they look like integers. All right. Next up, Boolean data. So this type is logical data type, and that can only take one of the logical values to be true or false. All right, so to make it real simple, a Boolean is always either true or false. And we're going to see why this is very important over the next couple of lectures. All right, so I have left something for last, and it's a bit more difficult to understand, or maybe it's just a bit more difficult to explain, but hopefully we're going to be able to do both. So basically, undefined. It's the data type that's automatically assigned to a variable that doesn't have a value yet. All right, so it actually sounds a bit more complicated than it actually is, and don't worry about it. I'm going to show you how it works a bit later, and really, once you get used to it, it'll be a piece of cake. All right? But what matters for now is that basically undefined means non-existent, doesn't exist. All right? Now, finally, there's another data type which is similar to undefined. It's null, but null, well, it's funny because null also means non-existent, but it's a little bit more specific. So again, we're going to talk about this later on, but I just wanted to give you that sort of differentiation, if you will. Undefined is not necessarily null. All right. So before we move on, there is something quite important to note here, and that is JavaScript has a feature, and that's called dynamic typing. All right. So it means that we don't have to manually define the data type of a variable like in many other programming languages. Basically, JavaScript automatically figures out if a variable is a string or a number, or if it's undefined or Boolean, and then assigns that data type to the variable without us having to do anything. So if we then later on decide that we want to change the assignment or assign another value to the same variable but with another data type, then guess what? JavaScript will automatically change the data type of the variable as well. See, so it's putting Java to work for you. All right? Can be very useful. Save us some coding in the future. However, it can also be the source of some difficult to find bugs. And that means error in the code. So we got to be pretty careful what we're going to do when with our variables. All right, so that's that. And now let's actually see some of these things in action. And let's go back to our code. Now to show you the Boolean data type, let's create a variable here. Let's call it isRegistered. So var isRegistered, and then say true. So here I want to say Alex is registered to school. Now remember, the Booleans can only be true or false. So in here, we can simply say true or false. I could, of course, also have written false, but in this case, well, Alex is registered at school and he has a school number. So now let's have a look at the console, and when we log this variable here, so is registered semicolon, and then go to our browser and reload it. Now you see here that it's true. So it also appears in this lively different color. What do you think? This one is blue, and the Alex string here is black. It also looks a bit different too. So this, of course, is not in quotes. We simply write out true like this because it's a reserved JavaScript keyword. Now, before we move on in this lecture, I want to quickly talk about what these variable names here are. So it's a pretty good practice. In fact, I would consider it best practice to always give variables meaningful names. So instead of simply writing something like X or ABC or mommy or something, we should never, well, we just got to avoid that, all right? We got to say in our variables exactly what we actually want or what this variable actually means. Be specific, be obvious. So in this case, here we have Alex, and that's a name. So we call this variable name and not just some random sequence of characters. And the same, of course, goes for school team, school number, and is registered. All right, so that's a best practice because if you ever have to read or have your code proofread, you don't want to be embarrassed, do you? Cool. Now, of course, it'll work the same way if we say X, for example, and I'll just put X here. Now, if we log it through console, of course, Alex is still here, but again, we want our variable names here to really have some meaning. That way we won't get lost later on. So this way of writing the variable name with this school word here and this team name here, where I separated them with a capital letter, that's also the so-called camel case notation. Have you heard of that? Camel case. Now, we could have done it like this, so school team all together, but then it would be kind of difficult to find where the second word starts, right? We could have also done it like this with an underscore, but in JavaScript, it's kind of a convention to use the camel case notation like this. So we start with a smaller letter in the beginning, and then when we have that second word, that one starts with a capital letter. So in the case of name here, for example, well, that's not the case because we only have one word. But here in school number, right, we have the second word, so we can make this N capital. Now, that's not about the JavaScript functionality itself. It's more of a programming convention and a best practice. Go ahead, search it or talk to your friends. Okay, so now I want to wrap this up. So let me just show you some rules that we have to keep in mind when we name our variables. So I already talked about some best practices when naming them, and that includes camel case notation. But that was not really a rule, right? It's just kind of a best practice. Now, actually, there are some rules, and that we do have to keep them in mind. So I don't want you to worry. Don't bristle at the word rule. They're actually pretty simple, and you'll see why. All you have to know is that variables cannot start with numbers or symbols, except for $sign or underscore. All right, so let's just try to break some of these rules and see what happens. So here, if I put a exclamation mark, okay, in front of name, here we're going to get an error. So here you can see our code editor is giving an error as well. What if we go to the browser? Here, I'll refresh the page, and we'll see an error that says unexpected token. All right, so again, it's not valid, and that means we cannot start a variable name with a symbol except for underscore and $sign. So I'm going to show you this in case you start naming your own variables. You're not going to run into these errors or put them in and run into the errors and then remember that I told you. So that way you'll be able to figure out all this stuff. So always use these rules and these precautions and you'll be okay. Now, let's say you want to fix this here. We could either start with a letter or with a $sign or an underscore. And of course, these are the only symbols that can appear in a variable name here in JavaScript. You learn by repetition, folks. For example, let's type it out. With the $sign, it would work just fine. Let's try it with the underscore sign as well. All right, but as soon as I start putting in something else, well, then we get the error. All right, so that was the first rule again. All variable names must start with either an underscore, a $sign, or a letter. And in the second and last rule, we cannot use reserved JavaScript keywords as variable names. Something like function, for example, is not going to work. So var function equals 18, for example, and yeah, it's not going to work, right? You see the unexpected token function. Now, we can also not use something like delete, which is also a reserved keyword. And you're going to meet many of these keywords here throughout the course. But right now, just know that any of these keywords that we're going to be using later, something like if, for example, you won't be able to use as variable names. So that's, again, why I say variable names really do need to be our own personal made-up words, all right? Not necessarily the words that JavaScript already uses in its language. And you'll be discovering what all those are. All right, so that's actually all there is to know about the fundamentals of variables and data types. It's already a huge step forward, and you should be feeling very good. It's a very important concept in any programming language in the entire world. All right, so let's take a quick break right here, and we'll continue in the next section.